So I think you'll find many unexpected things, which is why the subtitle is It's Not What You Think. First, well, here's the picture of Grand Valley campus. We have a lovely campus. You should come visit it sometime if you haven't seen it. Another campus photograph. I took that one, actually. Another campus photograph. Besides, I do two things in life. I do psychology and I do jazz, right? So this is the trio that I play in regularly. And they're here today. I really appreciate that, guys. Stephen Duran, Richard Paschke, Kate Cragwell, my dear friend, and my lovely wife, Jennifer Gross. Behind them, actually, is a student from one of my courses now, Kurt. Thanks for coming out, Kurt. All right, so now on to the real content. All right, so let's talk about what we mean by perceived support. All right, so if you want to do science for something, you have to figure out how to measure it, of course. And so perceived support is measured by questions like these. There are people I can depend on to help me if I really need it. I have close relationships that provide me with a sense of emotional security and well-being. Here's the citation from this measure. You can measure this via questionnaire. You can measure it through structured interview. It doesn't seem to matter. You get the same results. Essentially, the difference among people who answer these questions range from strongly agree to all these questions and the typical length of a questionnaire. You can measure it well with 8 to 12 items. You might devote 40-some-odd items to it. The range really is between people who are absolutely confident their family and friends, would be supportive when needed, to people who doubt that. Even in clinical samples, people, who have been admitted to hospital for psychiatric reasons, these folks don't give consistently negative responses. So the range really is between yes, absolutely, to I'm not so sure. Now, the reason why you should care about perceived support, I guess, well, if you care about mental health, you should care about perceived support, because it turns out that people's responses to the questions that I just showed you, people's perceptions of the supportiveness of their family and friends, is a very good marker for all kinds of bad mental health outcomes. Notice I said marker, I didn't say cause. That was on purpose because I don't actually think it causes these things. All right, but these are well-replicated phenomena you can get every single time. The typical effect size is around R equals 0.25-ish to R equals 0.35-ish, if you're used to thinking that way. All right, so general citations, people with low perceived support have worse mental health. This is true for major depressive disorder as defined by the DSM or the ICD. So people with major depressive disorder have lower perceived social support than controls. Among people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, people with more severe forms of post-traumatic stress disorder have lower perceived support. This is a meta-analysis, by the way. This is also a meta-analysis. People with more psychotic symptoms defined in a wide, in the most broadest possible way, hallucinations, delusions, formal thought disorder, things like that, those folks have low perceived social support too. Looking at more of mental health outcomes within the normal range, you and I have different moments of positive emotion like enthusiasm, engagement, excitement, and negative emotion like worry, fear, and stress. And within the normal range, you still find that people with high positive affect have higher perceived support. People with low negative affect have higher perceived social support. Happiness, there's a whole body of literature on happiness, which I was invited to review once, and it turns out that people who have high perceived social support are happier than people who have low perceived social support. These are very consistent findings. Now, there's also a body of literature with regard to physical health outcomes. I actually don't know this work very well, but I know some of the key findings. If you were going to read about physical health these days, I would read Bert Uchino's work at the University of Utah. But it turns out that perceived support, low perceived support, forecasts living less long, controlling for all the obvious confounding factors. Now, it doesn't make sense to do this kind of study with young people, right? Because young people, fortunately, don't die typically very soon, right? So you need to do a study like this among people who are middle-aged or older. You have to follow them 10 to 20 years into the future. And then, of course, your death is a matter of public record, right? You can just actually look that up, right? And so in these studies, people with low perceived social support live shorter lives, controlling for Gender, health status, activities of daily living, etc. The whole kitchen sink, essentially. This is Lundstedt is at Brigham Young. That's a meta-analysis that reviews this work. All right, so when I first heard about this work when I was in graduate school, I thought, that can't be, right? There must be an obvious confound. Sick people don't get out very much. Gee, what a surprise. They have lower perceived social support, and of course, astonishingly, sick people die sooner than well people. People who do this kind of work go to great lengths to measure and statistically control for that. It doesn't seem to be that. Right? So an impressive finding. That's all I'm going to talk about with regard to physical health at this point. All right. Oh, I see how this is going to work. All right. Now, the dominant theory in social support research from the very beginnings of when it enters psychology is based on stress and coping theory. Stress and coping theory is an attempt to understand stressors. So, okay, I don't create a shadow when I stand in front of it. That's good. So the idea is that some event happens to you. You make two judgments of this event. One is this a threat? And secondly, do I have the resources to manage this stress? That determines the extent to which you develop psychological symptoms like anxiety and depression in response to this event. In addition, however, you might cope with this. Coping are deliberate actions designed to change the situation or regulate your emotion, different from defense mechanisms. Right? Defense mechanisms are unconscious by definition. So coping are deliberate, planful actions. And the skill by which you cope with stress, with events, determines whether you develop anxious or depressive symptoms, right? Very nice and straightforward. Perceived social support is supposed to work through this because you have a stressor. I had a flat tire, right? So I started using a compressor to fill it in order to come here today. My wife took over so I could iron my clothes, right? So I have this stressor. Oh, I've got this flat tire. How am I going to get here? My wife, thankfully, one, shows me how to use the compressor, and then secondly, finishes the job for me. As a result of that, I've coped successfully with the event. I do not see it as a threat. Can I manage this? Well, my wife can manage this. I might not be able to. All right, so in this idea, the direct supportive actions that she's given to me protects me from developing depressive and anxious symptoms following the event, and also, showing up for the talk on time. The idea then is that, I didn't realize I've moved that forward just as well. Perceived support, the primary topic of this presentation then, is derived from these processes. The reason why I have high perceived support is that people in my social network say and do useful things when I'm faced with stress that leads to more positive appraisals of the event. Yeah, I can manage this. It enhances my coping, and that's actually what leads to health outcomes. According to this model, perceived support and enacted support don't have direct links to health outcomes. I'm primarily interested in mental health outcomes. If you look at correlations, you have a measure of perceived support. If you have a measure of depression and anxiety, you'll get a correlation between the two, according to this theory, but it's not because perceived support directly leads to good mental health. It works through influencing appraisal and coping, which is how stress leads to poor mental health. So, all right. This is all very nice, and it's intuitively obvious. And my guess is that if the entire talk was based on this, that would be, yes, that's great, thank you very much, just as I expected. All right, the really interesting thing is that this model, as intuitively obvious as it is, doesn't actually fit the data very well. In fact, it doesn't fit the data well at all. And so let me review that pretty briefly. Measures of what your family and friends actually do for you, the specific help they get, show you how to use the compressor and then finish the job for you. Measured either by direct observation or interview or self-reports, isn't related very well to mental health. The meta-analytic estimate we get for this is that enacted support is linked to mental health at about R equals 0.12, which is a pretty small effect. In this meta-analysis, was it significant? It might be significant, I'm not sure. But the link between perceived support and mental health is quite a bit stronger, R equals 0.3. So if you remember from your statistics class, to really understand the size of a correlation, you have to square it. And this accounts for about 9% of the variance. This stays stuck at about 1.5. So that's actually about a 9-fold difference in magnitude. So inactive support doesn't have a strong link to mental health. There's another body of research, that finds that actually receiving inactive support is linked to worse mental health. All right? So some of the reasons why this correlation is lowish is because there's a large chunk of studies showing it works the other way. All right? Inactive support is linked to worse outcomes instead of good outcomes. And of course, there are lots of findings where the value is right around 0 as well. So it's a weak, inconsistent effect. It's hard to get, actually. All right, well, it appears that these links are probably wrong, actually. The link to inactive mental health, and this is very weak. Astonishingly, this has not been studied. I just can't understand this, all right? So since the late 1970s, this has been the obvious mechanism whereby inactive support would have its effects. There are maybe 6 or 8 studies that have been done on this. Oh, to put that in context, if you plug social support in as a keyword into Medline today, you will get probably 55,000 hits. Right? So this is a really large literature. Everybody does social support research. It's scattered, in medicine and nursing and social work and sociology and public health and, of course, also psychology. So only finding 6 or 8 studies that investigated is a tiny, tiny number out of 50,000 some, and it gets worse. Those studies do not find these links. So I might be premature in saying these links are not there, but we have very poor evidence at present that they are there. Richard, do you have a question?
In the meta-analyses, do they group studies together that define inactive support in the same way, or do definitions vary?
Inactive support is pretty consistently assessed, but they do distinguish between observed through behavioral observation, self-report, questionnaire, and interview. People consistently get the same findings. It's a pretty consistent non-finding. There's a body of literature where people try to say, well, maybe if you look at people with these characteristics and those characteristics, you'll get a stronger link, which is already kind of a fallback position. Those types of findings don't replicate well. There are a lot of people still working to try to get this to work. I gave up on it about 20 years ago, however, and that what I'm looking for is strong, highly replicable effects, right? And this is clearly not one of those. This is, all right, but inactive support doesn't seem to be. All right, well, it turns out that perceived support's link to how much support you actually get is only about R equals 0.35. Now, as psychology effects go, that's a perfectly respectable effect, right? Statistically significant. What more could you want? Well, it doesn't fit what the theory implies. The theory implies, well, it doesn't imply, it says that perceived support is primarily based on the social support that you get. All right? That's way too small of a value to be consistent with that prediction, right? Now, the theory is clear that perceived support is based on inactive support. Where the theory is vague is what the magnitude of that effect should be, right? So this area of the theories in this area of psychology are not very heavily quantified yet. So, right, so you get this vagueness about how strong the effect should be. But this is only about 10% overlap. Right? If you square that, you get proportion of variance explained, right? So this is only about a 10% overlap between perceived support and inactive support. Perceived support, a little bit of it is based on the social support you actually get, but not very much. Most of it is based on something else. Now, to me, this is really interesting. You have this pattern of findings, right? That makes total sense, right? You would believe it if I had stopped with the original theory, except that when you examine it using scientific method, the whole thing starts to unravel. Okay. It gets worse or better depending upon your point of view. Here are 2 types of effects that you see in social support literature. One is stress buffering. Now, I've talked about this already. Stress buffering, social support protects you from the negative effects of stress. In the absence of social support, then what you get is more stressful life events, more symptomatology. And that's what we have here. This is the classic form where with high social support, you might have high stress, but it doesn't really matter. It's the same as low stress. You're protected. The poor folks who have low social support Under low stress, social support doesn't really matter, right? I mean, if I ask, how are you doing? You say, I'm wonderful. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me to say, well, can I help you with that? It's like, what do you mean? Everything is wonderful. But you should get people with low social support, should have, under high stress conditions, many more symptoms than people with high social support. An alternative is that stress and social support are different mechanisms. All right, so people who have high stress have more symptoms. People with low social support have more symptoms, but stress and social support don't have anything to do with each other. As it turns out, this is a really hard effect to get. I tested for this maybe 20 times in my career. I got it maybe 3 or 4 times. If you look on studies where a diagnosis of major depressive disorder is what is being examined, you get it once and never again. First study finds it, no other study finds it. It's a hard effect to get. This you can get every single time. In the case of major depression, so in this paper, a Grand Valley student and I had the opportunity to read every study on social support, stressful life events, and major depression that was ever published in the English language. All but one found this effect. We found about 30 at that time. Only one found that effect. Richard? That's all right.
All these things are based on self-control.
Not all of them. Sometimes you do behavioral observations. But the behavioral observations aren't especially useful. This is a good point. This is fundamentally a subjective phenomenon, right? And more on that later. So for the students, what you typically learn in research methods is don't study subjective judgments, study things that you can observe independently. That's fine unless the thing you want to understand is by nature subjective, in which case you're not going to be able to capture what you're interested in by using highly objective measures. Now you can decide for yourself in this talk, can you still do science if you're studying subjective things, right? I think that you can form your own opinion about this, based on this talk, I guess. Okay, well, boy, this model is just not holding up very well, right? An active support, it's linked to perceived support, but not as strong as it should be, but an active support's not related to mental health. Here again, I haven't told you this literature. There's some studies that look at perceived support in appraisal and coping, surprisingly not very many. They are not especially convincing. Now, we're with the dilemma of at what point do you conclude from no results that a theory is wrong, right? That's kind of a personal judgment, right? My judgment is that it's probably mostly wrong, right? And if that's the case, then that prompts you to think, okay, so how does this work then? What should we be doing? All right, so this is really what we've got. Stress is linked to mental health. I think this is probably a causal relationship, at least with stressful life events and onset of major depression. It sure looks like a causal relationship. Perceived support in mental health. I don't actually think that's a causal relationship. I'll try to clarify that later. It's still important, but I don't think it's a straightforward thing where perceived support causes mental health. Or if it does, I think that's probably a small part of what's really happening. All right. More disappointing research. From the very beginning of this research literature, at least when it moves into psychology in the late 70s, is to use this for intervention, especially prevention. If you could find people who lacked social support, and let's just say that we're confident that they are at risk for onset of mental disorders, then an obvious intervention is to somehow provide people with social support, and it should protect them from developing mental disorders. I see my life's work, really, as doing the basic science to support interventions. And this is why I think we still need to do this. In the late 70s, early 80s, we thought this would be extremely straightforward. But when social support interventions are examined in randomized controlled trials, they consistently don't work. Now, what I mean by randomized controlled trial is you have a group of vulnerable people, you randomly assign them to receive social support or to be in an appropriate control condition. In one very large-scale study on adjustment to breast cancer in women, the social support intervention is you are assigned to a support group The control condition was breast cancer education, right? Which might be useful but should be different than social support. To nearly everyone's surprise, this study showed no effects. If you look at this literature, I'd recommend this reference first of all because it's newer. This is a paper of our research team that's older. You can find one or two studies that show an effect in randomized controlled trials for social support, but the vast majority of them show no effect. All right, clearly something is wrong here. If we really understood perceived support, we'd be able to engineer it, right? If we really understood it, we would be able to figure out how some people could have more of it and other people could have less of it. We are unable to do that, right? So to me, that suggests we don't understand the phenomenon well. Well, here's another curve. You have, yeah. Sometimes I don't like to focus on what my slides say. This is one of those times. I'm going to skip these slides. This is an important point, but I'm going to stop after an hour. All right. Now, let's say that I give you a perceived social support questionnaire, like, my friends give me the emotional support that I need. So if I were having trouble with the difficulties, there's a friend who could help me. I can talk to my friends and families about worries without feeling funny about it later. And I give you this measure, and you get a very high score, which I hope that you would, because I've said before, it's a marker of good mental health. What have I really measured? One possibility is I've measured an aspect of your social environment. That was always the assumption that we had. Right? But another possibility is that I'm measuring your personality. And what I'm really getting when I do that is your general predisposition to say nice things about other people. And by say nice things, I don't mean to trivialize it. I mean you really see people positively or negatively. I might be a cynic. Yeah, you're trying to be really helpful, but I think you must want something. And then somebody else is thinking, oh, everybody's wonderful, As long as you try, then I think you're supportive. And you're very forgiving of the blunders that people make, and the wrong things that they say. How can we separate these two? Right? This is a really important question, because if you use the typical social support approach, you don't really know whether you're studying personality or not. Now, if you're studying personality instead of social environments, you're studying something totally different than you intend to. And that might work okay in the end, but I think you would agree with me, we really kind of need to know whether we're studying personality or aspects of the social environment. All right, well, it turns out that David Kenney, one of the people in psychology I admire most, developed the social relations model. He's an emeritus professor at the University of Connecticut, which if you design the study properly, I'll show you how to do that briefly in a minute, you can get 3 different effects. This is the personality part. We call it, when we're talking about social support research, recipient trait effects. The provider effects are objective supportiveness, and relationship effects I'll leave till last. All right, so let me go through and define these for these. These all are defined mathematically, so they have very precise meaning. I'm not going to trouble you with the equations. They're not hard, but who wants to look at equations in a talk like this? Instead, I have a better way of presenting it to you. So, you need a design in which you have a group of support recipients rating support providers. And notice, everybody rates everybody else. Right? So that's the prototypic best design for this kind of work. There are variations of the design, but this is the prototypic design. And you simply ask these recipients to rate these providers. You presume, or you need to verify that these people actually know these people here, otherwise you might be getting something different. All right. So recipient effects. Let me skip this slide and move to the demonstration, or example, I guess. All right, so here we have everybody's rating of supportive. Of course, if you're actually doing the research, you're converting these to a number, right? So let's say that less supportive is a 1, supportive is a 2, and more supportive is a 3. We have Peter, Tony, and Shell rating these folks. Notice, Peter thinks everybody is supportive. It doesn't matter who they are. Now, this is idealized, of course. I'm showing you a pattern whereby everything that's happening here is personality. Everything that's happening here is recipient trait biases. You don't get this with real data sets. And, of course, you would never do a study with 3 perceivers and 3 providers. This is just to show you visually what these effects actually look like. Tony, she sees everybody as supportive. It doesn't matter who they are. She sees everybody as supportive. Shell, bless his heart, he's skeptical about people. He sees everybody as unsupportive. Notice, this is all being driven by these people. It has nothing to do with these people up here. Now, if you want to think about this as a 2x2 ANOVA, totally cool to do that if you want. This is actually a variation of ANOVA. Then if this is factor A, then all the variance is determined by factor B. Factor B has no effect and there are no interactions. Now this is what we call a recipient. This is what I have on the slide here. Differences among recipients, the rating of supportiveness, blah, 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 average across providers. I think I've said this numerous times, I think. This is clearest, I think. All right, now let's get to the next thing that you can isolate, and those are provider effects. Now, I'll skip the text this time and go directly to this. Now, this is a very different pattern. It's the same characters. Everybody sees Anne Marie as most supportive. There's no disagreement. Everybody agrees that Doug the elder is supportive. Everybody agrees that Doug the younger, bless his heart, is not very supportive. Right? And notice, there's no disagreement here. In this case, who the providers are, who the recipients are, it just doesn't matter. And if you get the average score across all these folks, everybody gets a 2. The only thing that's going on is that everybody agrees that there's this rank ordering. Anne Marie is first, Doug is second, little Doug is third. And there's no interaction in the way that I presented it here. Now, this is as close as I think that you can get to social support as being an objective property of support providers, and this is what the field has always assumed. Now, I have to operationalize what objectively supportive is, yeah, right? Objective supportiveness is operationalized as things on which people agree with good accuracy as to what's happened, right? The physical world is like this. You know, you never know when you might need some, painter's tape at a talk. Drop it on the ground. There's no disagreement among us as to what has happened, right? And so in a sense, that's partly how we perceive the physical world as physical reality or as objective reality. Perceived support could work this way too. So think about yourself. Are you objectively supportive? Sure you are. Everybody thinks they're objectively supportive, right? Now another way that this could work, the last one, relationship effects, is like art appreciation, all right? So let me move a few slides down. All right, so these 3 persons look at these 3 paintings, right? They're all lovely. This painting is by Duren over there. This painting is by Richard's older brother. This painting is by Richard. Now, what you expect when people look at paintings is that there's substantial disagreement, right? You don't really expect that everyone agrees with your art tastes. And there's going to be this rank ordering whereby, Monet is best and Norman Rockwell is second and Picasso is last. That's not the way that it works, right? And in this example, there's no agreement at all about which art is best. So if you would calculate the scores down here, with worst art being 1, okay art being 2, best art being 3, this painting gets a 2, this painting gets a 2, this painting gets a 2. Likewise, we don't have a pattern here whereby any of these perceivers just happen to like art and some people don't. It's entirely a matter of personal taste. All right, now, if that makes sense, if it doesn't, please stop me because this is a key point for the rest of the talk, right? If that makes sense, then it would be really quite straightforward to plug in support providers here, right? So you're judging people on their supportiveness, you're not judging art anymore. It would be exactly the same thing. And this looks like an ANOVA, right? So you should be able to estimate effect sizes for each one of these things, and in fact you can. Back to here. So if we go back to our original scenario of support providers and support recipients, here it looks like art appreciation. There's no agreement that any one provider is more supportive than the other. There is no bias whereby some people just like everything and other people like nothing. It's all a matter of taste, all idiosyncratic to perceivers. All right, well, I actually have in the next slide, or very nearly the next slide, pretty precise estimates as to how much perceived support is, a perceptual bias on your part to see everybody as supportive or not, agreement among you all that some people are objectively supportive and other people objectively not supportive, or the extent to which supportiveness is a matter of personal taste. Just like art appreciation, I presume. I don't know. I presume art appreciation is like personal taste. I personally think it's fun to try to forecast, guess how these things will work out, right? So the metric is going to be percentage of variance explained, right? Big effects are going to account for large amounts of variance. Small effects will account for little amounts of variance. If you think social support is entirely objective, we could rank order each of us in the room on our supportiveness, and we get, fundamentally not different than we agree what happens when blue tape falls, right? Then provider effects or support that's objectively supportive should account for what? 80, 90% of the variance, 70% of the variance at least, something like that. All right, so I personally think it's entertaining to do this. And here are the findings in a slide or two. Here they are. This is replicated across 9 studies that include over 6,000 dyads. That means if I rate you and I rate you, those are 2 dyads, right? 'Cause you and me are a dyad, you and me are a dyad. These studies are from the United States, Holland, Italy, and the United Kingdom. About half of them are from the US. No, probably 2/3 are from the US. And this is what we get. This, to me, is the most interesting one. 9% of the variance is agreement among observers that some people are more supportive than others. That's significant. In an absolute sense, 9% of the variance isn't that small. That corresponds to a correlation of about R equals 0.3, right? That's pretty typical. But within the context of everything else, it doesn't look so strong. About a quarter of it are people's perceptual biases to see other people as supportive or not. The overwhelming majority is who is supportive looks more like art appreciation. You and me might systematically disagree in judging the same people on their supportiveness. This was mostly unexpected. This original study was not designed to detect this. The original study was designed to detect the magnitude of these 2 things. It just turns out that it also estimated this, and this is huge. So then attention for some investigators then is turned to understanding what this is and how we can think about it. All right, I have one more finding to show you. That's very briefly. Yeah, I don't want to talk about this right now. This is basically in a different design that can't separate objectively supportive people from social support as art appreciation. You get basically the same effect. There are reasons why you would want to use that design, but I don't think I have time to go into it. When we get to questions, if you want to ask me about it, of course, I'd be happy to talk about it. All right, let's skip this. Yeah, let's skip this for now. Maybe I'll come back if I have time. All right, here's another fact. You've already seen that an act of support is not a very good marker of how supportive someone is perceived to be. Let me phrase that a little bit differently. You've already seen that your judgment of somebody else's supportiveness, if you're like the typical person, right, is not primarily based on the help that they provided with you in the past for stressors. About 10% of it is, but that's all. It turns out that your judgment of that person and how similar he or she is in attitudes and values and what they like to do is a much stronger marker of supportiveness. So perceived support, you think it was based on what people have done for you, but a much stronger indicator is, do they like the same things you do? Do they have the same socio-political attitudes as you do? Are they similar to you in background? Are they similar to you in personality? All right, now what we have at this point, I think, so this is sort of wrapping up one unit of this talk. We start off, I was doing this work in 1979 when it came to psychology, where we think this is going to be really straightforward and simple. We're going to measure social support. It must be good. We ask people's perceptions of it, and we get a measure of social support. But I've shown you that in the course of the last 20 or 30 years or so, it gets way more complicated than this. Perceived support's not really related to the support that you get very much. There's a little bit, but the actual support that you get isn't related to mental health outcomes. perceived support is mostly a matter of personal taste. It's not an objective property of the person. Okay, a little bit of it is an objective property of the person, right? But most of it isn't. Instead of, stress buffering effects, whereby social support protects you from stress, good luck with that, right? That is a really hard effect to get. I've totally lost confidence in it. I quit testing for it 20 years ago, actually. Instead, regardless of whether you're stressed, if you see your family and friends as supportive, you have better mental health. And a better marker of your friends and family supportive is if they're similar to you, but on things that have nothing to do with stress. It's not, does this person cope with stress more similarly? It is, does the person have the same religious and political beliefs that you do? And more trivial things as well. All right, so our research team has a theory. This is a formal published theory, blah, blah, blah. And these are the constraints, the factual constraints that we had in trying to figure out how this works. I've said a bunch of this stuff already, actually. I've said this, that this is about relationships. There is this chunk that reflects personality, but in the social relations model, you can separate that from the part that reflects relationships, and we always do that. All right? So the issue of how do we know it's not personality, the social relations model solves that. We estimate the personality part, we remove it so that we're just studying the relationship part. I skipped over that part. I've talked about these already. Okay, so the big dilemma is, if these are the empirical properties of perceived social support, how does this work, right? So the task would be, this is your homework assignment for the students, and before class on Wednesday, generate a theory that would explain what is happening with perceived social support. So this is what a former student of mine at ORHEC, when he was still a baccalaureate student at Wayne State, we developed this. It took quite a long time for us to write it up in a formal way. Ed's now an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh. These are the premises of RT. I think I will get through a description of it, and I'll show you some. I think I'll be able to show you some new findings before we run out of time. All right. First principle is that we think that people regulate their emotions and their thoughts and their actions through social interaction. So we were talking earlier about how individualistic psychology was. This is an attempt to really break away from that. So rather than focusing on, you're responsible for regulating your well-being by yourself, this theory says, well, actually what people typically do is they regulate their well-being through interactions with other people. Now, in this regard, we don't disagree with stress and coping theory. Stress and coping theory also presumes that you regulate your reactions to stress through interactions with other people. Second principle, social interaction regulates affect, action, and thought relationally. Now, the relational part, this is a theory that, let me go back a little bit, farther than I thought. This is a theory designed to explain this chunk right here. So the relationship aspect is statistically independent from these two, also conceptually independent. This is a theory that's just trying to explain this big hunk of relational. So the principle then, of course, to work that into the theory, and of course I think you can see how the theory is being driven by scientific findings, right, is that how social interactions regulate us is primarily relational. What that means is that it's a matter of taste. Right? Now, what regulates me? Right? Psychological science regulates me really well. Jazz regulates me really well. My wife and friends regulate me really, really well. Celebrities, not so much. Movies, I generally don't go to movies, right? They don't regulate me well. Now, by saying this, I assume that if you tick off what regulates you well and what doesn't regulate you, that you're going to disagree with me, right? So the whole principle is that how you regulate yourself through social interaction is probably very largely idiosyncratic to you. It works for you, but probably wouldn't work for somebody else. 3, this is a big break from traditional social support research. And this is essentially saying that what we're measuring in perceived support is not actually social support as people typically think of it. Now, I want to emphasize here that I'm not saying the type of social support interaction that I think everybody believes in. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, right? So the interaction where you have a stressor, you talk to a friend, the friend gives helpful guidance, you cope more effectively, you have less anxiety and depression. We're not saying that doesn't happen, but what we're saying is that perceived support doesn't reflect that, right? It's a different animal. Now, the vast majority of the evidence that we have that you should care about social support is based on perceived support measures, right? So it's not trivial, but it's a different animal. This is one of the reasons why face validity is so limited for understanding what a test measures. Right, so here's an instance where it seems obvious that perceived support measures the quality of the help that you get, except it doesn't. And the only way that you can know that is through careful scientific investigation. All right, now a key part here is this happens through really ordinary social interaction. The way that we regulate our emotions and thoughts in real time, in a moment by moment, day by day fashion, through ordinary conversations and ordinary activities. The fabric of daily life is an important part of how we regulate ourselves, and that's actually what perceived support measures are picking up, according to this theory. I mean, this suggests that the ordinary is much more important on a day-by-day basis than is the extraordinary. Not saying the extraordinary is not important. Yes, Frank?
I could take that first two sentences out of Vygotsky's definition of human development and the exact same sentence.
First two words?
Yeah, I would say
Yeah.
primarily an ordinary and when consequence of social interaction. That is Vygotsky's
That's
definition of human development.
cool to know.
The idea that you develop more through common interactions with your
Right,
friends
yes.
and cookies
Right.
than you do major life events.
Yes. Now, what this theory provides that Vygotsky doesn't is a methodology and a set of facts for quantifying all that.
Yeah, but he was in Russia in the 1930s.
I know, right? This actually, the first people who started doing this work, since we're talking about history of psychology, at the University of Illinois in the early 1960s. It's actually derived from Crumbach's theory of generalizability. David Kinney would not agree with this, by the way, and I understand why. And it got picked up by a graduate student who had been a math baccalaureate student, Norman Endler. David Kinney addresses it for a whole new set of situations and really runs with it. Norman Endler drops it after a period of time. Norman Endler suffered from bipolar disorder. And from reading his biography, my guess is that his disorder made it harder for him to take this any further. All right, that's a nice observation. Thank you. Wait a second. That seems like the same thing. Ordinary affective social interaction. Oh, I see. What 3 is, sorry. What 3 is a general principle, how we regulate emotion and cognition and action through day-to-day social interaction. It's idiosyncratic to us. This is the part that says the correlation between perceived support and emotional well-being reflects this process. All right. And active support sometimes matters, I guess, probably. I'm not sure. This is as much to be courteous to people who strongly disagree with this as anything else, to be perfectly honest with you. Relational regulation theory is a phenomenon we really want to capture, which we've rarely captured in research because it's kind of hard, is that this is a dynamic process. And and by dynamic, I only mean it changes over time. And channel surfing is the best example I can think of in our culture, right? So you're tired, you're bored, you may be a little distressed, you sit down in front of the television, you've got hundreds of channels to choose from, and there's nothing that's really great. So you watch this show for a while until it gets boring, and then you go to another show, and it's at least novel, so it picks you up a little more. After a while, the emotion starts dropping down again, so you switch channels again, and your affect improves, and you keep moving across different channels, trying to keep your affect and arousal, in a reasonable range. And whenever one particular channel stops working for you, you switch it and you do something else. Not everybody likes the same shows, right? Which is why there are, 300 some odd channels on television. So according to this idea, from this perspective, one of our primary goals is to regulate our emotional well-being, which of course includes thoughts and includes actions. We are moving across the social environment, interacting with lots of different people in different contexts. Some people make us feel good and do the things we want to do. We try to spend time with those people. Some people elicit poor emotional well-being. We try to avoid those folks. Notice they're not the same people, right? And you can see this very clearly in the sense of the people that you fall in love with. Notice, you think that person is the most objectively wonderful person in the world. But of course, you've noticed nobody else thinks that, right? Your friends humor you by saying, oh, yes, of course, this is the most wonderful person in the world. But I'm sure they like this person, but they're humoring you. And this is how we want it to be, right? If the person really was this objectively wonderful person, then everybody would be trying to poach your mate, right? Because this person, is so objective. You don't want to live in a world like that, I don't think. I don't want to live in a world like that where everybody's constantly trying to poach my wife because she's objectively wonderful, right? So I think it's good that it haven't turned out this way. All right, so of course in existing relationships, they vary in terms of how well they regulate you, right? So even in your best relationships, sometimes it is just the best things, and sometimes it's kind of tedious, sometimes it's kind of dull, sometimes they infuriate you, right? On average, if they're your good relationships, they do well. But even within the context of a single conversation, right, it's a very dynamic process. Sometimes a conversation starts out well, and you say the wrong thing, and the conversation just doesn't work beyond that. So I think you know what I'm saying. Now, with regard to interventions, I think what we know about relational influences in social support fits with the observation that social support interventions don't work very well. Social support interventions have an implicit assumption, and that is there are objectively supportive people out there. All we have to do is assign them to vulnerable people. Now, how these interventions work is typically either people are randomly assigned to support groups, or the majority of studies, the investigator who's running the study hires people as staff members who the investigator thinks are objectively supportive and sends those people out to visit people in need. So if I'm the investigator, I'm choosing people who I think are supportive. There's only one problem with that, and that is there's very little agreement on who is supportive. So who I think is supportive, the odds are not very good that you will think that person is supportive, right? So what I've probably done is I've sent a person out who some people find supportive, but other people find irritating. And on average, we get no overall effect. From the point of view of relational regulation theory, what we need to do is we need to match support recipients with support providers so that a naturally supportive relationship emerges. And then I think if you do the matching right, you can get out of the way, I think. So if the goal is to provide you with someone who's going to be unusually supportive, or you with somebody who's going to be unusually supportive, I can't reasonably take the person I find to be supportive and assign them to you. Right? There's very little reason to believe that you'll agree with me. What I need to do is to be able to pick out, this person will be uniquely supportive for you, and for you, this person will be uniquely supportive to you. It's basically like matchmaking. But in order to do that, we've got to have a technology for forecasting how you do it. You have to know how to do the work. And it has to be actually possible to forecast who you will see as uniquely supportive. It may not be possible to do that. Kate? Yeah? don't think it's ethnocentric because it's at a level of detail that's finer than ethnicity. So you're talking about, right. So it'd be like if you were the person who were ethnocentric. I know you're not, right? But just for the sake of example, I hope that's okay. All right, so if, who would you rather have? A person from your basic, background who really cares about cars and rugby, or a person from a very different background who loves literature and cooking? I think you would choose the person from a. So the point I'm saying here is that this is at a level of analysis that's much, much finer than general categories of people. It also suggests that matching patients by gender of therapists is probably too coarse. The matching happens probably at a finer level of analysis. Now, there's no guarantee that we can do this. I mean, this is when you're trying to find a lifelong romantic partner, I mean, it's really the same task. Right? You meet people, you date people, you sort people, trying to find the one that's going to regulate you well, over the next several decades. So in a way, you think this can be done, right? That is pretty tedious, though, isn't it? Well, I thought it was pretty tedious. All right, so, here's a figure of what relational regulation theory says. It strikes me as being in the wrong place right now. But if I've described this well, then notice, though I've said I don't think that perceived support is a likely cause. I think it actually emerges from effective regulation. So it's a marker for a process that's important. I don't think it causes much, if anything. Okay, well, I started making a point without paying attention to the slides. Here's the point I'm trying to get to. Jeez. All right. Yeah. This is about forecasting. Now, the way that this work would, the statistical question, I guess I'll leave this as the last point, so I'm basically out of time. The statistical question is that if you want to forecast relational things, what you're forecasting is actually a profile. You can't reduce a relationship profile, a relationship effect, to a single score. Actually, this slide shows this. This is in the context of trying to forecast which therapists will be uniquely supportive to patients. So let's say that this client has this particular profile in terms of how supportive they see these therapists. This client has a different profile. This client has a different profile still. Now, what psychologists typically want to do is to forecast these things from a single variable, like a personality measure, for example, or attachment style, or something like that. The problem is that what you're stuck with is using a single score, and you're trying to forecast a profile from a single score. You can't do that, right? There is more information in this profile than you can possibly contain in a single score. So what that means is that you have to forecast profiles from other profiles. Once you are accustomed to that, then it works like any other set of inferential statistics based on the general linear model that you've ever heard of. Now, one final study before we move on. Veenstra. Veenstra is a Grand Valley alumna who earned her PhD in clinical psychology at Wayne State University. This was her audition piece for graduate school, basically. 2 studies. People have interactions with a group of providers over multiple conversations across different periods of time. In one study, the study lasts for 3 weeks. In another study, it lasts 3 or 4 months. People have an initial short conversation with a support provider, and then they actually get to know the person over weeks and months. What we're trying to forecast is people's relational scores, that's their unique profile of who they see as supportive, at the end of the study from their first very brief conversation. And what we found is that, in fact, we could do that. I don't think I have any results on this slide. All right. We could, in fact, do this. So this is encouraging. It shows we understand how to study this. And in principle, it seems to be possible to forecast it. One of the chief things that we're doing at Grand Valley right now is we've developed a measure really of what people like to talk about And we have a series of studies where we're trying to find out how can you forecast relational support, the people that you will see as uniquely supportive, on the basis of similarities in what you like to talk about and what the other person likes to talk about. If we can do this, final point, if we can do this, then the next step will be to launch interventions. We'll start at Grand Valley because we're there, take freshmen at risk for mental health problems and match them with people who our research suggests they should see those folks as unusually supportive. We, of course, will do this in a randomized controlled trial where some people will be matched. I'm not sure what the appropriate control condition would be. I don't want to mismatch people. That could be really obnoxious. But we're getting close to being able to develop an alternative approach to intervention and then to begin testing it. If we cannot, this all presumes we can forecast who will be uniquely supportive to whom. If we can't do that, then of course we don't do an intervention because we lack the basic knowledge, that we need. So it's been an hour. Now would be a good time to stop. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to try to field any questions you have. You had your hand up for a while. Yeah.
In the conversation, you didn't tell them a certain thing to talk about. You just said talk with them.
Yeah, that's right. Now later, in the one study, in conversations 3, 4, and 5, we prompted people to talk about a recent stressor. Not because we thought that mattered, but we were thinking in terms of trying to make it easier to publish it. We video recorded all these interactions, and most of the time, people don't. They do the obligatory, oh yeah, well, I have this hangnail. Now, what about this TV show? That's kind of how it works. Yes, Frank?
So let's assume you can do this. What does supportive look like? What would happen in this intervention? Now you've matched these together.
That's a great question because it reminds me of something I rarely think of. I just mentioned that we had videotaped all these interactions. I ended up watching all of them. I think I must have coded some of them as well. And there's one interaction that really stuck out, especially when you compared it with the previous interaction. All right, so this is a young college-age woman. That study was actually done at Wayne State. And she has an interaction with somebody else in the study, and it's a 20-minute conversation, and they are working to get to 20 minutes. You know, those kind of conversations where you are just working hard to have any conversation at all. And they rate each other. So then the next one comes up. These two women are talking. I said, one of them is the same woman I just saw. And for 20 minutes, they talk faster, and there's more positive interaction with every exchange. And so at the end, it's this bubbling up and cascading of, positive affect. It was really remarkable to see, especially in contrast with the same woman with another woman, actually earlier that day. So I assume there was low negative emotion. Now, I hope, ask again if that wasn't an adequate answer, but notice I made no reference to stress and coping.
Right, but so you've done this, you've developed this model where you can prepare people, if you will. Mm-hmm. So what? As a practical level now, how does it work with an intervention? Do you create opportunities for them to engage further? What's the
Well, I think you have to, I haven't thought it through yet, but let me tell you my thoughts. And let me also talk about it in a psychotherapy situation, too. I'll talk about the Grand Valley scenario, because if we actually do an intervention before I retire, that'll probably be where it happens. So we'll essentially it would look like where you're a freshman, and we don't want to say that you're at risk, so you might present it as freshmen, sometimes have difficulty adjusting. And part of the problem is finding people who you will get along with well. We've done some research that we can maybe make this easier. We would like to suggest the following 5 people who you seem pretty similar to and you might get along with. They've agreed to have their names and email presented to you. And of course, everyone in this group would be assigned that. And then you would, I think, get out of the way, because you want to make it, that's the goal, to be able to launch something that will take care of itself, because otherwise it's an expensive intervention. Right? Now with psychotherapy, I used to direct the training clinic, the PhD program in clinical psychology at Wayne. And if We're doing that again. What I would do differently, assuming that I could get away with this, is we would monitor patient improvement every week. If after some particular period of time, there's actually information in the literature on this that we could choose, I just not in my head right now. If you haven't shown substantial improvements, we assign you to a different therapist. The idea here is that your first therapist can't be that great of a match. It's possible that you're incurable. We don't want to say that, right? So try a different therapist. If you don't get a big bounce within a certain period of time from that therapist, try a different therapist. This is sort of how we find our long-term romantic partners. It's probably hugely inefficient. It would be better to be able to forecast what therapist you would respond uniquely to. We know how to do that kind of work, but we don't know how to actually do the forecasting. We know how to study it, but we haven't figured it out.
You see this generalizable to other groups. I'm thinking adolescents, I'm thinking children in school, where development of friendships, and, the children who are bullied are oftentimes marginalized.
Yeah. Have no idea. There are big relationship effects in conflict in children. I don't know about bullying per se, but I assume they are related. I do not know whether it's possible to do this in any group. So it'll be an empirical question to see how well it generalizes. Yes.
So it sounds like you're saying similarity creates some sort of resonance.
Yes.
That creates that notion of support or that perception of support. If you were to take like a multi-measure, like a 16PF or something like that, and develop typologies of those using, and then using some sort of regression analysis, you could ultimately then pick your partner.
It turns out that similarity in personality is not a good marker of relationship happiness. And so Eli Finkel and colleagues have a psychological science in the public interest issue that just came out last year where they reviewed this work exhaustively. There's very little reason to believe that the matching is based on personality. So the alternative approach that we're trying is in what you like to talk about.
That wouldn't be driven by a multi-point notion of what personality is.
Maybe, yeah. Although I think the theory says, the theory could be totally wrong, of course, right? But the theory says that ordinary conversation is more proximate to the phenomena we're interested in. And so I think my judgment is that that's a better shot than personality. I mean, yes, I think I agree with you. That's probably subsequent to personality and some other things.
We both like music. Is there not a foundation that we share that leads us to?
There must be, right? You must be a music fan too, right?
Well,
Yeah.
My first career was as a health psychologist, so some of the things that you're saying sort of rocked my world a little bit because multiple studies demonstrated, at least allegedly, that people with end-stage renal cancer,
Yeah.
HIV,
All right.
they live longer when they were in support groups than when
Yeah.
they were just provided information about their disorder. So,
Those, we might be thinking of different studies. The randomized controlled trials show weaker results than studies that are not randomized. It is true that perceived support forecasts many of those outcomes. I guess all that I could say is, insofar as you're interested in this, write me and I'll send you the PDFs
yeah, no.
of the reviews of the literature.
But that motivated a tremendous activity at
Oh, it
the
did.
political level.
We all believed that it was true, right? I mean, how else could it work? It just turned out not to be as straightforward as we thought. I mean, when I started graduate school in 1980 and a research team doing this kind of work, I mean, we were just unbelievably naive in how we thought it was going to be really easy. Right? You find out what supportive people do. We thought it would look like Rogerian psychotherapy. You train people's families and friends, they'd be more supportive. Voila! It's just, it's been harder than that. But also, from my point of view, it's been a lot more interesting to be thrown all these curves and have to work so hard to figure out what the hell is this stuff.
So I guess with that, choosing a partner or maybe a friendship,
Well, if you like intelligent conversation.
Well, I mean, don't,
But a lot of people don't, you've noticed.
but although you say it's a connection about what we like to talk about, right?
Yes,
I mean, that's the biggest goal.
right. For you, yeah, that's the person you should be seeking. But I think it's more detailed than that. Rather than just about intelligent things.
Which reduces loneliness and, I mean, I think it has another effect.
Yeah, I think it likely does. I think Duran was next. Yeah.
Considering, I think the statistics still state that marriages have a 50% chance of divorce. Second marriages, those statistics go up. To use your
Yeah.
analogy, that doesn't bode well for psychotherapists if you're finding, and this, I'm not joking, this is a valid question here. If you're looking for a psychotherapist, the odds are not very good you're going to find one. And what is the role of the therapist?
Well,
Counterintuitive to this.
oh yeah, sorry. One of them is that marriages seem to be unstable if you look at divorce rates. And then a similar point is that good pairings of therapists and patients should be similarly unstable. So let me just riff in response to that. Hopefully I provide an answer you like. If I don't, just tell me. I think relationships are fundamentally unstable, right? Because all that needs to change is the kinds of things that regulate you. And unless your spouse also changes in the same direction, then you probably regulate your spouse less well than you used to. I think part of the reasons why our culture has all these provisions for keeping couples together is because you need something to keep couples together. Notice, religions and the state do not need to tell you to eat. You'll do that on your own. We have to worry about that. The religion of the state doesn't have to tell you to be interested in sex. You'll do that anyway. All right, we don't need to regulate it. Staying together with the same partner for decades, religion and the state need to regulate that. And I think that's a hint that it's a little unstable. Now, with a therapist, most relationships with therapists are shorter duration, right? You don't expect to have your therapist for decades. And what the therapist is trying to do is a fairly narrow goal, right? So so I think you have fewer opportunities for mismatch, maybe. Kate, you're a therapist, feel free to jump in. So I think the more restricted social interaction, the more constrained goals of psychotherapy might be an advantage. But of course, that's not what you're looking for in a long-term romantic partner. You want them to share almost every aspect of your life. You don't want your therapist to do that probably, which is probably a big advantage. You want your therapist to keep boundaries, right?
If you were choosing random, you wouldn't expect a very good outcome. But if you were able to develop a topology around therapy, that you were able to match up with your own preferences, you would maybe be closer and closer to multiple marriages.
Yeah, I think we do that with our friends and our spouses. We audition people. And if it's not working out, therapists, we don't do that for some reason, right? It's sort of like, well, this is a therapist you have, okay. And I think,
It's raised the question
yeah.
as to whether the therapist should engage in just some ordinary conversation in the course of the therapeutic.
You're right, it does. There is
procedure.
there is that implication, and that's not the way it's supposed to work. Several people over here have been wanting to say something. I don't know, so let me make sure. You can go first.
There was an article by The Independent about case management managers and with mental health disorders about how it's hard to connect with them because our DSL assessment. When doing the matching system, do you think it might be incorrect because the mental health disorder is holding them back from the result?
Yeah, that's possible. The only issue, though, is that, this is a deep question that I've thought about some, but I've never had to actually totally figure out. Yeah, I don't know about that. Now, mental health disorders are typically defined as trait effects, right? So if you have major depressive disorder or if you have dissociative identity disorder, by definition, that's a feature of you that's stable across situation and time. So, yeah, so relationship effects are not trait effects. And then that creates some conceptual problems, it creates some analytic problems. I've thought a little bit about how to get around it, but I'm not going to give a good answer to your question, but just to say that's probably a much deeper question than you thought it was when you started. It's a real intractable problem theoretically and conceptually. I'm not sure what to do with. Yeah, I have no idea. Yeah. Now, one thing that we know about schizophrenia, though, is that people with schizophrenia who live with highly critical family members relapse at greater rates. So at a basic level, you might say that people who suffer from schizophrenia would be better matched with people who are not at all prone to criticism. That's a matching phenomenon. But I suspect that the way that this will actually work is much, much more fine-grained than that. But the practical implication, I think, would be what one can do now is simply observe what kinds of people does this patient do well with, what kind of people does this person not do well with. And it may not be the obvious choices, like the expressed emotion literature raise the possibility that if family members are highly critical, then spending a lot of time with family members is probably not good with regard to relapse in schizophrenia. I'm sorry. No, those are really good questions. I don't really know what level of match is required to get certain effects. I know in principle how to find out about that, but there's no research on it yet. I see that as a pretty advanced question. Very good question. It's good for you. You in the back had a question.
Yeah, so with this process, it kind of sounds like you're almost trying to match people to friendship, kind of?
Yes.
Based on similarities. So do you think there's other applications to this? Dating apps are really popular. So do you think there's the applications for your collaborative dating app?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you could actually match people with good lifelong partners, it would be one of the greatest contributions to humanity ever. The companies that claim to match people are proprietary. They do not share the evidence that they have. They do not share the actual algorithms for matching. In my personal judgment, there's very little reason to believe that they can actually do this, in part because they're basing matching on similarity and conventional personality, like 5 factors. They don't always call it that, but if you look at the items, it sure looks like 5 factors. And similarity in 5-factor traits are not good indicators of well-being among couples. I suppose it could forecast it initially and then drop out, but that's not encouraging, right? That it doesn't work that way. So I suspect they can't actually do what they claim. But because it's proprietary and it's not open for public discussion and evaluation, we can't know how good they are at it. Kurt?
So pretty much you're just matching based on what you like to talk about. And presumably you're also matching age, socioeconomic status, and possibly sex as well.
Yeah, because I'm sure that those things are correlated with what people like to talk about, and what people like to do. Well, this is our first crack at it, is similarity in what people like to talk about and what people like to do, which those two things are related. And, we won't have the research findings for probably about a year from now at the earliest, and we'll see how well we do. If we do well, we can start refining it, and I think that would address some of the questions you're raising. If we can't do it at all, we have a major problem, right? And I just don't know what we're going to do if we can't do it at all. So we would never get to your questions if we can't do it.
What's your sample look like now?
Well, we have 3 studies underway. One's completed. One is a study of college roommates. They rate each other, so you can isolate relational support. They also complete our measures of what people like to talk about, what they like to do. We have nearly finished a study of strangers among freshmen. because this has got to occur. This kind of matching should occur. It's related to what I was saying with regard to your point. This kind of matching, if it's going to be useful, should occur in established relationships, and it should occur among strangers. People come in and have 20-minute conversations. Actually, all the phenomena that I showed you about perceived social support being relational emerges really fast among people who really don't know each other at all. It seems like it should work with strangers. And then another one is a group of resident assistants. So resident assistants are they're really employees of the university. They're college students. They look over particular floors of residence halls. They know each other well. Why resident assistants? As one of the research team members is especially interested in resident assistants. That's the only reason. So we'll have these 3 samples. We'll be able to cross-validate anything. We're only interested in stuff that's strong and replicates in all 3. Something we get in one we're not interested in. We'll see. Jenny?
While you're working to resolve this fine-tuned understanding of what makes for this good match, could the PANIS be a short-term way of saying this is an effective match? You know, are you getting positive affect from this match?
That's primarily how we look at short-term emotional reactions to interactions with people. So we use that in every single study. But you knew that, I think. So I'm curious about the question. I must have misunderstood the question.
No.
Yeah.
No, I was just thinking that people are looking for an answer. Like right now, how am I going to know if this is going to be an effective therapeutic match? And I was just
Oh, well, if the answer is how you're going to know, I don't have anything to say that you don't already know. Wait, I'm sorry. What's the rest of
I
it?
was just thinking that, you know, that forecasts, you know, whether or not somebody thinks someone is an effective teacher, and actually
Yeah.
forecasts learning that they actually in the classroom.
Okay.
So could that be just a way to simply?
I think I understand what you're saying now. I think what Jenny is saying is, all right, so in your life, how do you make these judgments? And that's the part where I thought, I think I can't tell you anything you don't already know. If you like this person, spend time with them. If you don't like this person, try to avoid them within the constraints of politeness and morality. If a relationship is consistently bad, you really should consider cutting that person loose. Of course, there are other constraints if there are children and if you have a marriage vow, right? But I think the point that you're raising is what information should you pay attention to? And that is pay attention to positive emotion, enthusiasm, excitement, alertness, interest. Pay attention to negative emotion, anxiety, nervousness, fear, worry. Those are probably, I get it, those are probably the most proximal markers of this whole mechanism, and they probably deserve special attention. Was that?
Yes, and you
All
have
right.
high PA and low NA.
Right. High positive affect, low negative affect. Some people, I think, like, here's a glitch though, off in the soon. Some people seek out contexts that make them anxious, right? Scary movies are fun only if they're scary, right? A movie that's supposed to be scary that isn't scary is a huge snooze. Roller coasters are fun because they scare the living daylights out of you. And so if there are contexts where people seek situations that make them anxious, then in principle, some people might seek out relationships that make them anxious. Maybe because for those people, anxiety and excitement go together. I don't know. Your question.
I have a question. When I was in high school or junior high, I went through this depression state, and since then and during that time, I have tried to help other people who had depressional states, and that's actually what I'm going into in a career as I'm going to be a counselor. But my theory, call it, is that you need to find one friend, one person who you can talk to, who's there for you, just one good friend, and then that'll help you get out of it. So I've always tried to be that friend, and everyone else told me, no, they need professional help. No, you should tell them to go get professional help. Whatever. So is that kind of, how does that really fit into your theory, being that friendships are based on?
It fits really well, I think, but I think you might be expecting too much of yourself, right? So in social support research, there's a big difference between people who have one relationship that they see as supportive and people who have no one. And that's a really big difference. I don't know what the rest of that function looks like. I think you get additional bang for your buck from additional people, but I'm not totally sure. But let me address your question more specifically. I mean, one of the best things you could possibly have are close friends. Right? And so I think close friends are enormously valuable. You're laughing because it's such a tautology, not tautology, but a trite thing to say. I think that if your friends are work that well for you, the likelihood that you need psychotherapy is probably greatly reduced. I think people vary in how many friends they need and how varied those people are. I don't have evidence for this. This is just, mostly this is my observations. Some people are happy with a single close friend. They don't really need anybody else. And other people really do need multiple different people in order to regulate themselves well. Given how idiosyncratic, all right, this is something that I think might be helpful to you, maybe not. But most people who want to be psychotherapists have the sense that they're supposed to be the most supportive person in the room, right? So throughout most of my life, I was trying to be the most supportive person in the room. So I'd be competing with Kate here, I suppose then. But if supportiveness is hugely relational, you can give up, right? There is no most supportive person in the room, unless maybe it's Gandhi or Jesus or something, but neither of those guys are here. So the people who like you see you as supportive. The people who don't like you will not see you as supportive. You can be yourself. Your friends will like you anyway. You don't have to try so hard. A person who doesn't really, that you don't easily evoke these things in this person, you're probably not the right person for that person. And so, to me, I found that very liberating, right? I don't have to try to be the most supportive person in the room anymore. Yes.
So do you think a good approach to improving therapy, like a procedure where like the recipient interviews all the providers
Yes.
to make a choice about what
Yes. This is speed dating.
like like literally up front, that's the first thing that
Yep.
you do.
I do. I can't imagine therapists wanting to do that. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like the most obvious thing to do is you have a therapist with you have a therapy session with a bunch of therapists and then you start pruning them. But if you were a therapist, would you want to go through that? I don't know.
No, if you're in therapy, you have to understand that from a statistical point of view, if that's what works, why wouldn't you want to, have that procedure for your patient?
Well, people aren't always as rational as that. And I think you even see that in medicine, for example, whereby there are new interventions are developed that are clearly superior, and medicine doesn't always embrace them immediately. Sometimes it's because people like staying with old familiar ways, and so sometimes people don't understand the rationale for it. Sometimes people don't believe the research. So, in a perfectly rational world, yes, I agree with you completely.
It's a good thing that, research and people are progressing.
Oh, yeah, I think the overall trajectory of human history, I think, is, upward swing, especially with regard to, understanding the world. Were there other, especially, is there someone who wanted to ask something or say something that hasn't had a chance that I've missed? Okay. You look like you're about to wrap things up, and it is time.
Honoring your time.
All right. Thanks very much.